everyone. In this video, we are going to be talking about healing racialized wounds. So we will be talking about experiences of racism, racialized trauma, trauma responses in general, and how they impact and show up in the Asian American community, as well as ways that we can start healing these racialized wounds and processing our experiences of racism. So when we talk about racialized trauma, I think it's really important that we take a step back and we define trauma. Trauma is less about an event itself and more about an individual's experience or perception of an event. So trauma can actually, to be more exact, can be described as anything an individual's nervous system perceives as overwhelming. There's also oftentimes a sense of threat. So there can be a sense of fear or terror, as well as a sense of loss of control, loss of power, loss of agency. And when we talk about racialized trauma is any trauma that is related to experiences of racism. And these experiences, they can both be direct as well as indirect. So indirect trauma responses or indirect trauma looks more like trauma that is developed based off of listening to other people share their stories about their experiences of racism. So your friends or families telling you. This can also look like reading the news and reading about attacks on our elderly community. Or the Atlanta shooting, for instance. You can have developed a racialized trauma response due to reading about that case, even though you did not experience that trauma directly yourself. So, racialized trauma can also happen as a result of hearing about other groups that have been historically minoritized and historically oppressed. So even hearing about Latinx folks and their experiences of racism, or Black African American folks and their experiences, that can elicit a trauma response in you as well. So we as humans, our nervous systems are always sensing for cues of safety and unsafety. So what this looks like is when we start to sense any type of threat, our bodies will automatically put us into a fight, flight, high energy freeze, or flop response. And I know for a lot of y'all, maybe that high energy freeze, flop response, you haven't heard those terms before, so I will go back to those. But in general, your body is, we as humans, we're wired to survive. And so if at any time we sense threat, our body, our brain will automatically employ a stress response. So we'll get mobilized to run, to fight off our threat. And for the high energy freeze, that's actually when you feel really activated, but you're just frozen and you can't move, kind of like deer in headlights, as well as the flop response comes as a result of your nervous system perceiving that the only option is to play dead. So basically what that looks like is, in modern terms, is more of a depressive, collapsed energy. So like I said, there are evolutionary purposes for fight, flight, freeze response and flop response. And in modern day context, though, we don't necessarily have that discharge of energy that comes with being able to run away from our threat or fight off our threat. And so oftentimes that energy, it's so mobilizing, it just gets stuck and stored in our bodies. And essentially these stress responses, our stress response system, it ends up becoming maintained. And so these stress responses, they just live within us. So these stress responses, they end up getting stored within us and continue to send signals of unsafety to your brain. So the stress hormones, they just keep getting pumped out, and stress responses that haven't moved through us unhealed trauma responses can then end up looking like generalized anxiety, hypervigilance, a lot of irritability, anger problems, as well as depressive symptoms, low energy, lethargy. And so when we talk about healing trauma, or we talk about healing racialized stress, processing experiences of trauma, as well as processing experiences of racism, the key is to connect into our bodies. And I will come back to that after I talk more about racialized trauma and how it specifically can show up in Asian Americans. So as humans, we are wired to do two things. I mentioned that we are wired for survival. We are wired to find safety. And we are also wired to connect to others. And we are wired to find a sense of belonging. And basically, experiences of racism, they threaten both of these constructs, both of these needs. Experiences of racism often threaten our sense of physical safety, as well as our emotional well-being. So our ability to be authentically ourselves wholly and be accepted. So because experiences of racism pose a threat to both of these constructs, it makes it really important for us to work through these experiences and to heal from our trauma responses. One thing that I tend to see with working with my Asian American clients, as well as talking with friends and family, and even resonates with me personally, is that we have a tendency to minimize, to invalidate, to kind of brush off our experiences of racism. This is often due to maybe how we've been taught by our family to make sense of experiences of racism, or maybe what we haven't been taught. So maybe like kind of like rhetoric around turning the other cheek, being the better person, don't let yourself get swept up in your emotions. And it is also this tendency to invalidate, to minimize our experiences, also a result of how we are socialized as Asian Americans. I know there is a video on this app about the model minority myth. I really strongly encourage that you also watch that to have a better context of how we are racialized and socialized here in the US. Oftentimes I notice that we have a tendency to maybe compare our experiences to other groups. So we may say like, well, we don't have it as bad as other groups, so we don't actually experience racism. Oftentimes we are told that things are a joke and that we are too sensitive if we react. And so we have then learned to also subscribe to that, to internalize that, to think that these things are a joke. And so we start to like invalidate, minimize our feelings of hurt or our feelings of uneasiness around certain jokes that are made. The problem with this is that when we do not allow ourselves to name these experiences and to really sit with them and feel them and process them, those stress responses, they stay laden in our bodies essentially. So when we experience those jokes or those comments or those microaggressions, oftentimes there is like a tensing in our bodies that happens. There's a drop in the stomach that happens. There's a flush in the cheek. And all of those physiological responses stay in our system with nowhere to go because we have learned to repress them, suppress them, ignore them, kind of just brush them away. When these stress responses stay in our system without acknowledgement, what can then happen is that they build up in the system and then create all sorts of chaos because they manifest themselves in other ways, such as oftentimes trauma creates disconnection, disorientation, and shame, and a sense of shame. And experiences of racism almost always also come with a sense of shame for the person who's experiencing these experiences. So what can then happen is that we develop a sense of shame for ourselves. We think that we are broken and we want to distance and disconnect ourselves from our identity and our culture. and our Asianness. Unmetabolized racialized trauma can also show up as, other than internalized racism, it can also show up as a sense of imposter syndrome, so never feeling good enough, as well as perfectionism, maybe just heightened anxiety, anger issues, stuff that I also referenced before of, in general, how unmetabolized trauma responses can show up. So one of our first steps that we can take towards healing our racialized trauma responses, as well as working through these experiences of racism, is to allow ourselves to really name and acknowledge and validate that our experiences were experiences of racism. It's okay to name that joke was messed up, it didn't feel good to hear, and it made you feel some type of way. And some type of way might be confused, it might be hurt, might be angry. It's okay to feel those feelings. After we have named them, I think it's really important that we really let ourselves feel what those feelings are. And this is something that a lot of us might not be used to. But what you can start to do is really try to connect and explore and be curious. For instance, I was angry. How did I know I was angry? Oh, my fists were starting to ball up. I was feeling my cheeks get really flushed, and I was starting to frown. If the emotion is hurt, how did I know I was hurt? Oh, I felt like something in my chest, and I felt really small, and I wanted to curl up. So just being curious about what physiological sensations are attached to the emotions that you feel. And those, oftentimes we like to go to thoughts. So it might be helpful to track your thoughts and then track the emotion and then kind of come into the body. Other than allowing ourselves to really feel and name and frame our experiences from the context of racism, another thing that we can really do is allow ourselves to find connection. So I mentioned before, trauma creates a sense of disconnection and fragmentation, and this can show up in terms of a disconnection with self, disconnection with identity, with culture, disconnection with just people and friends in general. Like I said before, with experiences of racism, oftentimes they're really shame-laden, and so we often try to make sense of them on our own. We stay quiet, we isolate, and we keep them to ourselves. So that is also harmful on top of our tendency to just minimize and invalidate them anyways. But because shame is so laden with experiences of racism and racialized trauma, it is really important that we explore how we can connect. So how we might connect to others with shared experiences, how we might connect with our culture, with our identity, and repair that relationship. How we might repair our relationship with our parents if that has been kind of eroded due to experiences of racialized trauma. Finding community, finding connection can really kind of start to soothe and soften our experiences of racialized trauma. I know I'm running out of time on this video, so I'm going to point you towards the exercises and journal prompts that are listed to kind of give you a little more direction in how you might start really implementing some of these practices. But letting yourself name, letting yourself feel your feelings, as well as finding that connection, those are some of the first few steps that you can start exploring to heal your racialized wounds and really start to work through these experiences of racism. And I also want to let you know, I will end on this last, and I want to leave you with these last parting words. Like I said before, because experiences of racism are so shame-laden, they can often feel like you're the only one that is experiencing that discomfort or that type of experience. They can feel really isolating. So just know that that experience is not an isolated experience for you, and know that It's not because you're broken. It's not because you're messed up. It's not because our culture is messed up or broken. This is very much a product of a system that isn't meant to help us feel safe and good. So just know it's not you, it's the system. Okay, thank you for joining me and watching this video today.